For anyone who has either lived in or traveled through post-Soviet spaces, one of the striking features that many people comment on is the remaining legacy of the era's buildings. Drab, repetitive, unremarkable beyond just how much of it was made from concrete, the Khrushchevka, Brezhnevka, Plattenbau, and Panelhas litter urban landscapes to this day. So it often comes as a surprise that there is some remarkable and unique building that came from the Soviet era. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the evolution, uniqueness, and surprising creativity of Soviet architecture. This is the Cold War. Soviet history is often quite complex, with deep threads related to culture and memory running through it. But there is no denying the impact that specific individuals have had on that history, which is why I am so pleased to recommend an outstanding biography I watched recently on Magellan TV on Georgy Zhukov, part of their Great Commanders series. The video looks at his personal background, his tactical and strategic skills, and the impact he had on history. And this is just one video in a series which looks at other great commanders, as well, including Nelson, Bonaparte, and Grant. And one of the best things about the video, it is completely ad-free, just like every video on Magellan TV, including the new 4K content that's being added every week. And Cold War viewers will get a 1-month free trial by clicking on the link in the description. Make sure to start your free trial of Magellan TV so you can join us in watching Georgy Zhukov. In previous episodes, we've looked at the cultural experiences of Soviet citizens in the spheres of education, tourism, and consumerism, among others. But what about architecture? In a society as authoritarian and ideological as the Soviet Union, no form of cultural expression was immune from being used for propaganda purposes, and this includes building design. On the surface, architecture might seem like an odd choice, given how standardized many things were in the USSR. Western perceptions of Soviet architecture are far from inspiring. Endless, depressing suburbs consisting of identical apartment blocks, brutalist concrete public spaces, and grandiose propagandistic monuments all immediately come to mind. But this stereotype isn't altogether accurate. The Cold War, and other international influences in fact, had a major impact on Soviet architecture in the post-war period, resulting in a variety of rather bizarre and surprisingly expressive creations across all 15 republics and even internationally. Before we jump into this topic, a quick definition. Cold War Soviet architecture is often associated with the brutalist movement of the 1950s. To quote, "Brutalist buildings are characterized by minimalist constructions that showcase the bare building materials and structural elements over decorative design. The style commonly makes use of exposed, unpainted concrete or brick, angular geometric shapes, and a predominantly monochromatic color palette. Other materials, such as steel, timber, and glass, are also featured." The word brutalism is not linked to an aesthetic of being brutal or harsh, but rather from the French term béton brut, meaning raw concrete, just so we're all on the same page. Now, to best understand the development of Soviet architecture during the Cold War, we need to go back to the formation of the USSR on December 30th, 1922, to look at the key beliefs underpinning the new country. The Soviet state was, at its core, motivated by a belief that communism would bring modernity and progress to the lands of the former Russian Empire. This is well illustrated by one of the Bolsheviks' early decrees from December 1919, which strived for the elimination of illiteracy, making literacy training mandatory for all citizens aged from 8 to 50. But the policy, known by its abbreviation Litbiez, was not merely an act of benevolence by the Bolshevik government. It deliberately set in motion a chain of events that would have a lasting impact on Soviet culture. Keep in mind that the complex Marxist theories that underpinned Bolshevik thinking were alien to the mostly illiterate peoples of the newly formed USSR, people that needed to be active political participants if the state was to survive. The Soviet state therefore faced a dilemma. How do we get our citizens to understand our thinking when most can't even read? In order to bridge this gap between the Soviets' complex ideological viewpoint and its widespread adoption, Soviet leaders, including Vladimir Lenin, increasingly turned to propagandized forms of entertainment to encourage the masses in their ideological fervor. Under Lenin's new economic policy, for instance, the consumption of high pre-revolutionary and petty bourgeois culture, like the theater, opera, cinema, and even the circus, was actively encouraged. Of course, this modernizing project needed public spaces to facilitate it. The immediate effect on architecture and the urban environment was remarkable. Palaces of culture were expanded into almost every village, town, and city. Acting as a kind of community center, these palaces of culture hosted public events and were vital hubs for communities right up until the USSR collapsed in 1991. Similarly, standalone cinemas, libraries, and theaters were built across the Soviet Union. The intention was to constantly broadcast Moscow's ideology to communities in every corner of the USSR. Following Lenin's death in 1924 and the rise of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet cultural sphere was dominated by the idea of kulturnost, translating roughly to culturedness. For Stalin, however, culturedness meant mass engagement with his own cult of personality first, and Soviet ideology second. This placed a new emphasis on marches, carnivals, and celebrations. Soviet urban planning therefore increasingly incorporated grand boulevards and avenues on which they could be held. For anybody who has ever driven down Kutuzovsky Prospect with little to no traffic on it may marvel at the size of the road in a country with relatively few cars in it, but they had a clear didactic purpose. Now, beyond urban planning, this period of Stalinist Soviet architecture is best known for its neo-Gothic style. The so-called Seven Sisters, which are scattered across Moscow, arguably provide the best examples of this. MGU, Moscow State University, is probably the most famous of these, but Warsaw's Palace of Culture and Science, an almost exact copy of the Seven Sisters architecture, was also gifted by the Soviets to Socialist Poland in 1955 as yet another beacon of Moscow's ideology. The destruction wrought by the Great Patriotic War, however, was devastating for the Soviet Union and resulted in this grand ideological construction project being brought to a halt. But with the onset of the Cold War, Soviet culture, including architecture, would change radically once again. Stalin's death in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev's subsequent rise to power coincided with both an urgent need to build housing and the acceleration of the USSR's post-war economic recovery. In the Stalinist period, Soviet housing was characterized by communal apartments, known as kommunalka in Russian. Typically built in the same neo-Gothic style mentioned earlier, they were not particularly cheap or easy to construct. They were also inadequate. All facilities, like the kitchen and bathrooms, were shared by up to 7 families. And each family also had to share just one room, regardless of their size. But with many of the USSR's 200 million inhabitants still without a home as late as 1956, and a rapidly growing population, these kommunalka became even more unfit for the requirements of the time. Khrushchev's solution was the humble 5-story apartment blocks we now see all over the former Soviet Union. Though they were limited to 5 stories, not for aesthetic reasons, but over concerns about the safety of building elevators, their construction was considered revolutionary in the Soviet Union for the period. Using prefabricated panels of concrete transported to the site, entire apartment blocks, complete with utilities like plumbing and heating, were constructed in a matter of days. For the first time, almost every Soviet family could have their own home. Soviet propaganda channels accordingly hailed this triumph of Soviet engineering and the state's provision of housing for the masses. Above all, though, these buildings were both cheap and easy to construct, ticking the necessary boxes. Cities like Yekaterinburg and Novosibirsk grew 10 times in size from 1917 to 1960 alone. These apartment blocks, now known as Khrushchevka, across the former Soviet Union, were also built to be adaptable to the wide range of climates across the Soviet Union. They can be found from Murmansk in the Russian Arctic to Tajikistan's capital, Dushanbe. And thus, the Soviet stereotype about gray apartment blocks was born. Khrushchev's housing policy was undoubtedly a success and still informs how many people picture the urban environment in the former USSR today. During the Brezhnev era, the Khrushchevka model would be expanded and more typically built for anywhere from 9 to 16 stories. Interesting examples of this development include the so-called houses on chicken legs, situated on St. Petersburg's Vasilevsky Island, and the round houses of Moscow, which fused the practicality of housing with the more experimental architectural influences that arrived later. So at this point, you're probably thinking that I'm crazy and that all these apartment blocks are all the same and that they aren't interesting. But this is only where the story of Soviet Cold War architecture really begins. Although Khrushchev is perhaps best remembered for his brazen mannerisms and ultimate removal, the cultural thaw that his tenure set in motion actually led to the creation of some of the most bizarre and striking buildings ever constructed. Indeed, Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 liberalized the Soviet cultural space and somewhat relaxed the relentlessness of the state's ideology. Khrushchev also pursued a foreign policy based on internationalism and peaceful coexistence with the West, which, for the first time, opened up the USSR to external influences. While Stalin's mass culture was based on the carnival and the parade, Khrushchev's was instead marked by the international exhibition and the trade fair. Soviet architects would seize upon this cultural moment to push the boundaries of artistic expression as far as they could. Beginning with the effects of the thaw on architecture, one of its key impacts was that it devolved significant autonomy to Soviet architects themselves. This autonomy did come with some limitations. Buildings still had to broadly represent their propagandizing principles of the state and be feasible to construct with the materials available in the USSR. However, though architects may have received a directive from the center to design a palace of culture or a cinema in a town, very few aesthetic instructions were given. This devolution also coincided with the liberalization of national expression. Devolution therefore meant that the architectural matters of each republic were, by and large, devolved to architects of that republic's nationality, who now had the freedom to reassert their cultural heritage in their work. The architecture of public spaces in the Soviet Union thus quickly became dehomogenized and represented more directly the cultural heritage of each republic and oblast. As Yevgeny Rozhanov and V. Shestopalov attest, regions like Central Asia, quote, became the true laboratory of local form, materials, and ornaments. For example, several Soviet-era buildings reflect the region's Islamic heritage. One example, famously featured in Stefano Perego and Roberto Conte's photo book, Soviet Asia, is the State Museum of the History of Uzbekistan. Originally built in 1970 as the Lenin Museum, its harsh concrete aesthetic both reflects stereotypes about the severity of Soviet architecture, but also complicates it, as its design is based on the traditional Uzbek Banzara pattern. Similar patterns can be found in the mosques of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva. Another example in Tashkent is the Palace of the Friendship of the Peoples. The architectural influences and the name itself reflect the post-war resurgence of the USSR as a brotherhood between nations, even if there was a gap between rhetoric and reality. In the meantime, architectural developments were taking place in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. As our two videos looking at how the Soviet Union annexed the Baltics explored, the destruction of individual national identities in the Baltic republics was not exactly welcomed with open arms. But architects in these republics seized on the opportunity to reassert their cultural heritage. Notably, constructions in Estonia like Mariame and Linnahall are mostly free from Soviet symbolism and actually appeal much more to modernism above all else. Research by Trin Ohari of the Estonian Museum of Architecture suggests that this is because architects who led projects in Estonia, like Mart Port, who was in charge of housing policy, were entirely Estonian. As such, Estonians' Finno-Ugric heritage and its cultural affinity with more minimalist Nordic design survived the period. Equally, the 1980 Moscow Olympics sailing competitions were held in Tallinn, which provided another opportunity for local architects to jump on the Soviets' modernizing bandwagon to bring their visions to life. The Olympic Hotel in Estonia's capital is an example of one such construction and is still used as a hotel today. Now, no video on Soviet architecture would be complete without mentioning Christopher Herwig's marvelous book, Soviet Bus Stops. Students of architecture at Soviet universities were frequently given the task of designing bus stops for their local communities. Like Khrushchevka, they had to be feasible and cheap, not exactly a surprise in the Soviet Union. But there was basically no aesthetic limitations. They did not even have to be functional. In Abkhazia, for example, the famous Georgian artist Zurab Tsereteli, who is still living and working in Georgia today, designed bus stops that did not even have roofs. Others were built to directly indicate what their purpose was, like this light bulb-shaped bus stop in Russia. This bus stop is located outside a factory that produced, you guessed it, light bulbs. These bus stops are not only fascinating and unique, but show how even in an authoritarian state, there were spaces for wide expression of creative freedom. It's clear then that Soviet architecture in the Cold War was not all about heavy concrete and prefab apartment blocks. And the fun doesn't stop there. In the 1950s and 60s, both modernism and the space race were in full swing. Politicians and artists alike imagined a perpetually peaceful future in which technological innovation and new ideas would propel humanity forward, regardless of their ideological divisions. Architecture was certainly not immune to this trend. During the interwar period, architects like Le Corbusier in France and the Bauhaus movement in Weimar, Germany had begun experimenting with the minimalist design principles that would inspire Cold War-era modernism. It was ultimately Khrushchev's internationalism that exposed Soviet architects to these artistic trends for the first time. Buildings that looked like spaceships started popping up across the Soviet Union in subsequent decades as a result. Take the lounge building of the Writers' Resort on Lake Sevan in Armenia, for example. The circuses of Bishkek and Dushanbe are even more direct manifestations of the UFO trend in Soviet architecture, but they are also near-perfect monuments to the optimistic and future-looking zeitgeist of the time. Elsewhere in the Caucasus in Georgia, the extent to which boundaries were being pushed reached an even more surprising level of incredulity. The Bank of Georgia building in Tbilisi provides such a case. Designed by Georgian architects George Chakhava and Zurab Jalaganya, and finished in 1975, its stacked rectangular structure is perhaps unlike any other building in the world. Like the bus stops, here aesthetics once again trump practicalities. And what about Soviet architecture outside the Soviet Union? Khrushchev's internationalism also harbored an explosion in trade ties with the Third World as the two ideological poles of the Cold War competed for influence in non-aligned states. Lukasz Stanek, in his remarkable book Architecture and Global Socialism, shows us how this played out on the ground in Ghana. Caught up in the decolonial and modernist fervor of the time, Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, invited architects from the Soviet Union alongside Britain to expand its capital, Accra. At the same time, the Soviet Union was already exporting its architectural principles to its satellite states in Eastern Europe. Thus, architects from the Soviet Union, the GDR, Poland, Hungary, and other states were sent to work with local Ghanaian architects. On the other hand, this resulted in some remarkably Soviet modernist-looking public spaces and housing projects being built in Ghana. Independence Square in Accra, for example, is clearly a rather distilled version of the grandiosity of the Soviet architectural modernizing project. Interestingly, many of these buildings were gifted to Ghana, although there were a few strings attached. The majority were actually built in exchange for Soviet credits, which ensured that future Ghanaian governments were obligated to buy Soviet exports of raw materials and whatnot at preferential prices. On the other hand, and maybe more interestingly, architecture in countries like Ghana provided a crucial insight into how the ideological battle of the Cold War played out on the ground. Ghanaian architects, for example, did not see themselves as aligned to the Soviet project or the Western one either. Rather, they, quote, perceived themselves as belonging to an international culture of modern architecture. The parallels with the experience of the Soviet republics' domestic adoption of architecture as a way to express their national cultures are evident. Moreover, the Soviets used their vision of architecture to directly contest their communist vision of modernity with that of the West in the Third World. As Stanek himself says, the work of Eastern European architects in West Africa showed that the relevance of this region in Soviet policy stemmed from its role as a site where the applicability of the socialist path of social and economic development was tested as a global project. All of this is to say then that the architecture of the Soviet Union provides a surprisingly useful lens through which to view not only how Cold War ideas shape Soviet culture, but how Soviet citizens themselves shaped Soviet culture. Odder still is the possibility that the most lasting legacies of Khrushchev's thaw and internationalism are to be found in architecture. The design principles that his policies unleashed indeed continued through Leonid Brezhnev's rule beyond the end of the Soviet internationalism, which ended with the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. These principles lasted, in fact, right up until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Though Soviet architecture certainly played into the Soviets' cultural modernizing project that we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the buildings it produced also represent much more. Beyond the Cold War, we hope some viewers might even be surprised by the beauty and elegance of these buildings. If nothing else, they certainly complicate the idea that everything in the Soviet Union was uniform and help to demonstrate that boundaries could be pushed and even broken within a monolithic state like the USSR. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. Just be sure not to confuse it with the giant concrete bell button that we have constructed to honor the struggle of bell buttons everywhere. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.